Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. Today we are going to do a passage, and from the passage we are going to learn some expressions and some greetings. Also we will do some new grammar with some old which we will revise over here. Now, as I have written both in Roman and in the script, well, those of you who want to appear for the JLPT exam, well, you can concentrate on the script and you can practice your hiragana and katakana, because you know, and I am sure a lot of you have already seen the site, that the exam is conducted in the script with kanji characters. So, you have to be prepared with the script. ですから、ひらがなもカタカナも覚えた方がいいと思います。And students who are not keen on doing the script, they just want to speak and just interact. Well, you don't have to concentrate at all on the script. You can just concentrate on the Roman part. That will help you in speech. Now, this kaiwa that I am going to do today, this passage that I have here is divided in 3 parts. So, the first part we are going to do today, and the other 2 we are going to do in our later lessons. So, let us see what we have here in the kaiwa for you.
すいませんですが、日本の習慣のことをあんまり知らないので教えてくれませんか？
じゃあね、まず日本人はご飯を食べる前にいただきますと言います。
それはわかりますけど、食べた後も何か言いますね。
そうですね。でもラオさん、どこで聞きましたか？
この間、田中先生のお宅に行った時に、食事の後子供たちが何か言いました。私は恥ずかしくて聞きませんでした。
ラオさん、恥ずかしいことはありません。わからないとき、いつも聞いてください。日本人はご飯を食べた後、ごちそうさまと言います。
ありがとうございます。世話になりました。
So, you just heard the kaiwa, and the kaiwa is between Rao and Hana. Hana is a Japanese name, and generally ko is added after the names of girls. So, actually it is Hanako, but Hana is also used. Hana-san or Hana-chan. すみませんですが、日本の習慣のことあまり知らないので教えてくれませんか？ So, すみませんですが。You have done this expression before asking something. So, well, you would use すみませんですが, and ga means but. Even though I am asking you, but please, could you tell me? So, 日本の習慣のこと、習慣 is culture. Culture no koto. You did koto last time. This is a new usage of koto which we are going to do now. あまり知らないので I do not understand Japanese culture. Thus, therefore, 教えてくれませんか? Won't you please tell me? The verb is 教える and くれる. These two join together and become polite, which you have done just now in your lesson 21. じゃあね, okay, in that case, well then, mazu. Mazu is first and foremost. 日本人はご飯を食べる前に。食べる前に means before eating. いただきますと言います。と言います is they say. And いただきます is an expression used generally before eating or drinking by the Japanese. I have a picture also later for you. What they do is they join their hands, thank God, thank the person who has cooked the meal. So, basically a prayer to the Almighty. それはわかりますけど, well, he says, I understand that. けど, but informal. 食べた後も何か言いますね。食べた ato. Ato is later and tabeta is in past tense. So, tabeta ato, after eating. Mo, also, nanika, something. Imasu ne, they also say something after eating. What is that? He could have said, sore wa nan desu ka? Sore wa nan desu ka? Well, Hana-chan says, so desu ne. Doko de kikimashita ka? Where did you hear it? They do say something, but where did you hear it? Kono aida, the other day. Tanaka sensei no otaku ni itta toki ni. Otaku is uchi. So, when you talk about someone else's uchi, just to be polite and respectful, you would say otaku. And O is the honorific over here, which is now joined with the word taku and has become one word. And for uchi, otaku is used when you are talking about somebody else's house. So, sensei no otaku ni itta toki ni, when I had gone there. Okay, itta is past tense, toki is time. So, when I was there, ni. Because it is time expression, so particle ni. Shokuji no ato, shokuji is meals. No ato, after meals. Kodomo tachi ga nanika imashita, they said something. Imashita is said and nanika is something. Watashi wa hazukashikute kikimasen deshita. I was very shy and thus did not ask. Kikimasu is to listen. Kiku, the verb is kiku, to listen and to ask, both. So, kikimasen deshita, I did not ask, and not, I did not hear. Rao-san, hazukashi koto wa arimasen. Again, koto is used in a different way. You have done it differently in your previous lesson. I am just going to take it up after the explanation. Rao-san, hazukashi koto wa arimasen. You don't have to be shy. Wakaranai toki, when you do not understand. Itsumo, always. Kiite kudasai, please ask. Nihonjin wa gohan o tabeta ato, gochiso sama to imasu. Gochiso sama to imasu. They say gochiso sama. So, this is a small kaiwa where there are two important things, itadakimasu and gochiso sama. Gochiso sama is again, thank you very much for the meal. This is in the script, so you have nihon again, mai ni, mai, gohan, we are going to take this up, taberu also, nihonjin, then ato also we are going to take in the kanji, then kikimasu, kikimasu, sensei. You can go over all the kanjis and the other kanjis which are left, we are going to do sometime during our course. So, well, you just heard the kaiwa, and so let us start with the first part of the kaiwa. Now, the first thing was hazukashikute. You have done this joining of adjectives, I adjectives and na adjectives with kute. So, if the first adjective is I, then if you join it with another adjective, it is joined with kute. For example, you will see akai, akakute, akakute, kirei desu. Akakute oishii desu. Oishikute yasui desu. Nagakute benri desu. And today we have something different, which is with a verb. So, hazukashikute kikimasen. So, now you will see that you can use the kute form with verbs as well. Now, what are those? Let us see. Akai, yasui. So, remove the I from here. Put kute with another adjective, ini, akakute, oishii desu, or yasukute, kirei this. Na adjective, I adjective. This is what you have done so far, joining two I adjectives or joining I adjectives and na adjectives with kute. Now today what have you done? You have done adjective kute with a verb. For example, hazukashi, remove the I as we did over here, kute kikimasen deshita, or hazukashi kute hanashimasen deshita. So you will see that you can also join verbs over here with kute form. Now in our last lesson we learned verb plus koto ga dekiru, which shows ability to perform an activity. Today we saw a new usage of koto, which is noun plus no koto. Now the word koto is a noun. Koto means pertaining to a thing, to an incident, to some matter. But remember, it is not something material. It refers to whatever is being mentioned there in the sentence. Now noun no koto is used with verbs as well, like shiru, wasureru, hanasu. So let us see what they are. So sensei no koto, gakusei no koto. What does this mean? About sensei, about gakusei, indo no koto. So you will see that no is used with koto. Noun no koto. Koto means related to, pertaining to, about whatever the noun is. What is the difference between the two in this and this? Well, this is hanasu koto, iu koto. So one, there is no no. Two, this is pertaining to the noun, about the noun, but this is activity. Whatever the verb is saying, hanasu koto, about talking, related to talking. And then the verb is dekimasu or masen over here. I cannot do this activity, or I can do this activity. That's the basic difference. So now let us see what it means. As you can see over here, about noun or regarding the noun. Gakusei no koto, I just told you. So with nouns you can use with no. With adjectives you will see before koto it's either omoshiroi or in the past tense omoshiro katta. Remove the I and put katta. Or with na adjectives, benri na koto desu or benri datta koto desu. Of course, this you may not be able to use that easily at the moment. These two will be more easy to use. So you can see now. Okaasan no koto o hanashite kudasai. Please talk about your mother, regarding your mother. Ashita no kaigi no koto o wasurenai de kudasai. Do not forget tomorrow's meeting. About tomorrow's meeting. Then, nichiyoubi no picnic no koto o wasuremashita ka? Have you forgotten about the picnic we are going to have on Sunday? Have you forgotten about the picnic? So, about again. So, over here you can have any noun. Noun can be anything. Daigaku no koto. Nihon no daigaku no koto shitte imasu ka? Todai no koto shitte imasu ka? Todai no koto shirimasen. or shitte imasu. Now, Indo no koto o yoku shitte masu ne. Yoku shitte masu ne. So, you will see over here that we have shiru verb, we have hanasu, and we have wasureru. These three verbs are mainly used. There are other verbs as well. You will see. Indo no koto o yoku shitte masu ne. So, you know a lot about India, isn't it? Then Taro wa Indo no shukan no koto wa amari shiranai. Taro wa Indo no shukan, about Indian culture. About Indian culture. Amari shiranai. We are going to do amari just now. Amari will make a negative sentence, and the verb over here will always be in negative. The meaning will be towards negative. So, Taro wa Indo no shukan no koto wa amari shiranai. He does not know much about Indian culture. Omoshiroi koto o kikimashita. So, I have heard something very, very interesting. Something. Omoshiroi koto. Something which is very, very interesting. I have heard. Daiji na koto o kikimashita. Daiji na koto o oshiemasu. I will tell you something very, very important. So, over here koto is something, about something. Ii koto o oshiete agemasu. Ii koto, something very good. Again, something very good. Oshiete agemasu. I will tell you. Then, omoshiroi koto o oshiete agemasu. Over here, omoshiroi koto o kikimashita. Omoshiroi koto o oshiete agemasu. I am sure these examples are making it very clear how to use koto. Over here, koto is with adjective. This is noun. Noun over here. And then again, adjective and adjective. Daiji na, na adjective. So, I am sure this is very clear how to use koto. There is more for you. Minasan, wakarimashita ka? So, I can ask you now. I have told you so much. So, minasan, wakarimashita ka? Iie sensei, wakaranai koto ga takusan arimasu. So, sensei, not at all. There are a lot of things I do not understand. Lot of things. So, over here takusan is there, which is similar to yoku. Yoku you cannot measure, whereas takusan you can count, you can see, you can measure. If you say, Iie sensei yoku wakarimasen kedo, I do not know how many, but then how many, I am not very sure. Douyu koto desu ka? What is the matter? Douyu koto. What is the matter is what it means. So, different ways you can use koto. That is what I am trying to show to you. You did earlier with nouns, you did with adjectives, and these are certain special ways you can use koto. Ashita kara suru koto ga arimasen. Ashita is tomorrow. As you know, time expression. Kara from. Suru, do. Koto is thing. Ga arimasen, I do not have. So, from tomorrow I have nothing to do. Nothing to do. I am free. Ashita kara hima desu. Suru koto ga arimasen. I have nothing to do from tomorrow. I have lot of free time. Taro, okaasan ga itta koto o oboete imasu ka? So, now somebody older is saying, because he says Taro. So, this is a direct statement over here to Taro. The person who is saying is definitely older to Taro, could be his father, his uncle, and because he says Okaasan, that means he knows that Taro might forget what Oka-san or his mother has told him. So, Taro, Oka-san ga yutta koto, whatever she has said. Yutta koto o oboite imasu ka? Do you remember what she has told you? Said or told in this case, told you. So, different ways of using koto. With verb over here, with verb again over here, with verb over here. So, you will notice that verb is in plain form before koto. Now, what happens over here is that koto is a noun, this is a verb. When the two join together, this becomes a noun phrase, or it changes it into a noun. The verb changes into a noun when koto is added. So, then it can be used like a noun. Minasan, wakarimashita ka? Hai, ja suzukemashou. Now, there is still more. Minasan, ashita no kaigi no koto. About the kaigi, wasurenai de. Shiken de yoku dekinakatta koto o wasurete kudasai. Shiken de, noun de, during the shiken. De yoku dekinakatta koto. Yoku is you do not know how much. So, some kind of degree, but cannot be measured. Shiken de yoku dekinakatta koto. Something that you could not do during shiken. Koto, thing. O wasurete kudasai. You can also add a mo over here. Mo wasurete kudasai. It is all right, time has come for you to now forget it, not to bother so much. Instead of shiken, you can add any of this over here. Mensetsu is interview, toron is debate, kaigi is meeting, you know, and happyo is presentation. So, happyo de yoku dekinakatta koto o wasurete kudasai. That you could not perform well, please forget. Then we have watashi wa fude de, by fude kanji o kaku koto ga dekimasu. This is what we did in our last lesson. This activity of writing with fude, I can do. Fude is brush. So, before koto, verb will be in plain form, verb in plain form, noun no koto, adjective as is, and na adjective na koto. This is the most important part over here. This means noun no koto means about noun, and verb no koto is activity. Now, we also have amari in our kaiwa, you just saw. It is an adverb and means not that much or not very much. It is used in negative sentences and meaning is always in the negative. So, amari not that much. Now, anmari is also used. The spelling is A-N-M-A-R-I, is also used in conversation for more emphasis. Ammari, a-m-mari. So, this sound is nasal and more stress is over here like ammari. Though N is written, but M is pronounced. But when we write, amari is preferred and it means the same as anmari. Ammari is just a phonological variant and meaning is exactly the same, it does not change. For example, you can say watashi wa amari ikitaku nai with verbs. Amari ikitaku nai. I don't want to go. Amari yaritaku nai. I don't want to do. Amari shitakunai. Tanaka-san to amari hanashitakunai. So all the time you will see that verb is in the negative and the meaning is also in the amari. I am not very keen on doing this. So you have with verb, then you have with noun, with adjective and with na adjective. See how it is made. Saifu ni okane ga amari arimasen. Amari nai, as is given over here. Saifu is your purse, your wallet. Ni okane ga, you can see it over there. So ga arimasen. If you say Saifu ni okane ga arimasen, then there is no okane. Saifu ni okane ga amari arimasen, you don't have that much. Now, eiga wa amari omoshiroku nakatta desu. Amari omoshiroi. Omoshiroi. And because amari is there, you cannot use omoshiroi, so you have to change it in the negative. And how do you change adjectives in the negative? Takai, remove the I, put ku. Takaku arimasen. It is not that expensive. Now this is in the past. This is past negative because you've already seen the eiga. So eiga wa amari omoshiroku nakatta. And this. So if you remember, we had done that this does not change whether it is negative, whether it is positive, whether it is in past or past negative. What changes over here is this part. Yasuku nai. Yasuku arimasen. Yasuku nai desu. And takaku nakatta, this is given over here. This part doesn't change, this part changes. So just go back to your lessons and see, I have also revised it in the first week, so you can see it over there as well. Nihongo ga amari jouzu de wa arimasen. So na adjective. Nihongo ga amari, not that much. Jouzu is good. You have done this kanji. So jouzu de wa arimasen. Na adjectives and nouns follow a similar pattern. So de wa arimasen. Hon de wa arimasen. Kono jisho wa amari benri de wa nai. Kono jisho, this jisho, or kono ei wa jiten wa amari benri de wa nai. Kono jisho, this dictionary, or kono ei wa jiten, English Japanese dictionary wa amari benri de wa nai. It is not that useful. It is not that convenient. I am sure you've got it now, how to use amari with verbs and nouns, na adjectives and adjectives. So practice this with your partner. Now there was also a word maini. You have done maini with arimasu. Tsukue no ue ni hon ga arimasu. So it shows presence of an object in front of something or related to something. So over here it is ue. In a similar manner, you can use mae. Tsukue no mae ni isu ga arimasu. Ga aru. Tsukue no mae ni isu ga aru. This is what you have done earlier, showing presence of another thing with relation to another object, basically used as prepositions, though they are not called prepositions in Japanese, but in English, in and on at, under, below is what we can relate to. So now what does this mean? Noun no maeni and verb in plain form. So it does not refer to front, it tells you about situation. Basically before an action something is happening. So we will see that just now. Shiken no mae ni benkyou shite kudasai. So shiken is noun, no mae ni, before the shiken, which is test. Before the shiken, benkyou shite kudasai. Who would say that? Your mother would say that, or your teachers would say that, or somebody who cares for you would say that. Before a shiken, please study. Shiken no mae ni benkyou shite kudasai. Or happyou no mae ni iroiro shinakereba narimasen. Before the happyou presentation, I have to do a lot of things. I must do a lot of things. Taro-kun to Rao-san wa shiken no mae ni eiga o mimashita. Before the shiken, what did they do? They saw a film. So this talks about situation and not about existence of a certain thing with relation to another. It's a simple construction, noun no mae ni. Before, ahead, front of are the basic meanings for mae ni. Here we are using these two. Now verb plus mae ni, how do we use that? This is something that your mother would have always told you. Taberu mae ni te o araimasu. You wash your hands before eating. Taberu mae ni, before eating. Te o araimasu or taberu mae ni te o aratte kudasai. Please wash your hands before eating. Te of course is here, very easy to remember now. 1, 2, 3 and 4, 4-stroke character. You also have mae over here, which means ahead or before. So you can see the character 1, 2, 3. You make a tsuki and then like this. I'll write it again like this, mae. How many strokes to it? 1, 2, 3, ichi, ni, san, shi, go, roku, nana, hachi and kyu. So 9 strokes to this character. Then we also have neru mae ni ha o migaite kudasai. Please brush your teeth before you sleep. Or neru mae ni hamigaki o shite kudasai. Hamigaki is brushing teeth. Hamigaki o shite kudasai. Please brush your teeth before sleeping. Then you have heya ni hairu mae ni, before you enter. Hairu, that's the kanji. So this is the first and this is the second stroke. Hairu mae ni, before. Nokku shite ne. So your elder brother is telling you, you just entered the room without telling him and he is getting very angry and he says, heya ni hairu mae ni nokku shite ne. Please knock before entering. Or heya ni hairu mae ni koe o kakete ne. Please call before entering. Kakeru is also call out aloud. Kakeru has lot of meanings. One of them is koe o kakete. Please call out before entering. Call my name before entering. Ask permission. Then in our kaiwa we also had atode. If you are going to do mae, then you also have to do ato. What does it mean? It's a conjunction which shows that after one action is completed, the next action is going to take place. So now how are you going to understand it? You can only understand it with sentences. I have lots of them. Noun no ato, like you did noun no mae, So in a similar manner, noun no ato de, after. This one action is over, then you do the second action, and verb is going to be in ta form, which is past. Now how is it done? When you see the sentences, you will understand. Shokuji no ato de eiga o mimashita. So what can you see from here? That the action has completed, as I told you just now, and also this is talking about the past. All of this action is over because mimashita is used. I saw. Shokuji no ato de, after I had my shokuji, eiga o mimashita. I saw the film. Then you have more over here. Shucho no ato de, after I came back from my tour. Shucho is tour, going on office duty outside from town. So shucho no ato de, after I came back from shucho, 2日間 yasumimashita. Yasumimashita. Yasumu is the verb. Yasumu. And yasunda is the plain form. The only difference between yasumimashita and yasunda is that this is more informal and this is more polite, to be used with people who are senior and informal situations. Meaning is exactly the same. Now you have a word over here which is kan, and this shows time span. 1ヶ月間, for example, 1ヶ月間, 2週間, 3日間, 3日間. Time span. The kanji for kan is simple because you have done this and nichi again. So this is just an extension of nichi like this. So now how many strokes to this character? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. So 12 strokes to kan. Aida. This is also aida. You also had this word in the lesson. So it's kan as well as aida, means time span, time period. Now, shokuji owatta ato de sugu benkyou shimashita. Shokuji ga also can be used over here. When talking during conversation, informal, ga can be removed. Shokuji owatta ato de, after I finished my shokuji, my meals, and you will see it is in past plain form. Sugu, sugu is immediately. Immediately, benkyou shimashita or benkyou hajimeta. I started to study. I started doing my benkyou. So, shokuji owatta ato de sugu benkyou shimashita. Again you will notice that this is all in the past. This activity is over. Now, sensei to hanashita ato de, after I talked to my sensei. In your last lesson, we did to also, which means with sensei, and ni also, talking to sensei. So, to and ni, the difference is of feeling. Sensei to hanashita toki, both are interacting, whereas sensei ni hanashita toki, only I am interacting. So, please remember that. Sensei to hanashita ato de, after I had talked with sensei, sugu jikken o hajimeta. I started doing my experiments. Or sugu jikken o yarimashita. I did my experiment. And over here it is started to do my experiments. So, all of this is in the past. This action is over. You are talking of something which you did in the past. Now, 明日授業の後で映画を見ましょう。Let us watch a film after our class. So, over here the activity is not over. 昨日クラスの後。So, the moment you have 昨日 it is in the past. 昨日クラスの後でミラと私は図書館に行きました。We went yesterday after class to the library. 薬を飲んだ後で after I had 薬一日中 all day long 寝ました I slept or 寝られなかった I could not sleep 薬を飲んだ後で after 飲んだ is drinking actually, but in English we would translate it to have. Now, we just did verb te kara and verb ta ato de. Well, te kara indicates that action has to happen immediately after the first activity. This is very clear with te kara, that the moment you do your first activity, immediately you have to do the second activity. Whereas with ta ato, generally what happens is you finish one activity and you may or may not do the activity immediately. It could happen any time later. And also you will realize that with te kara, the second activity is actually important, and so it is in your control. That is, you know that you have to do it and the time frame is also there. Whereas with ta ato de, the subject may not do the activity himself, or you could also say in one way that the action may not be in his control, could be out of his control completely. So, you can see 私は毎日シャワーを浴びてから寝ます。So, this activity important, this activity also important, but 寝てからシャワーを浴びます。No, 私は毎日シャワーを浴びてから寝ます。After I have taken my shower, I sleep. Or you also have 私は毎日シャワーを浴びて電話をしてから寝ます。Or 私は毎日電話してから寝ます。Or you could also say 私は毎日お母さんに to お母さん電話してから寝ます。After I have given her a call, talk to her, I sleep. So, immediately after this activity, you perform this second activity. Now, 散歩してからシャワーを浴びました。So, after I took a walk, I went for a shower. I took a shower as well. So, this activity first and then this activity, not the other way round. 毎日散歩した後でシャワーを浴びます。So, 散歩した後で means I took a 散歩 sometime. Maybe I go after 2 hours, take a shower, maybe I take it immediately, maybe I take it even later. So, ato de has this thing that this activity may not happen immediately after this first activity. This is the only important part over here. The more you use it, the easier it becomes. This is a statement, not something that the person has already done. So, well, I think this part is clear to all of you. So, with this, I think I will end the class here. All of you should practice what we have done. Remember verb te kara and verb ta kara, where it is to be used. Koto is also very easy. Make sentences and practice with your partner. you will be able to use it with nouns and with verbs and adjectives easily. Come prepared for your next class. We'll do something new and try to continue what we have left here in the kaiwa. There's lots more in the kaiwa. With this, thank you very much all of you and mata aimashou. Arigatou gozaimasu.